everybody, and welcome to the Heretic Hammer podcast. I am your host, Marshall, and this is my co-host, Dylan.
Hello, hello.
And today, we're curbing the trend of normal faction-based lore videos on YouTube and other forms of media. And we're talking about the Tau before Orcs, Necrons, Eldar, and Drukhari. And even Tyranids. We're not making them last. They're first. The first xenos species to get an episode.
Is that really a thing where everybody's got kind of like the same order they tend to follow when talking about these different factions?
There's definitely a common order, I feel like, but like other people, I think just like it depends. Like like Wes Hammer, I would say he does a decent job of kind of just floating in between. Doesn't really have an order. Like, it just kind of seems to bounce around to wherever his lore wishes seem to go. I mean, like, Luton has been doing this for years and years now, so hard to say really what his order was. I just know, especially from, like, recent videos, it's felt like Tau generally are last. The last ones mentioned. And if they're going chronologically, that would make some sense because start getting into their history a little bit. The Tau are one of the quote unquote newest factions of the 40k universe, lore wise. I think they initially came out in 3rd edition, which I think may technically predate some of the ways that current factions exist. Like, actually, that is true because there is technically a newer faction in the game, but in lore, the newest faction is the Tau Empire. So the Tau are one of the most unique factions in 40k. And as a result of this kind of ends up being a blessing and a curse. See, the Tau, to me, get an undeserved bad rap amongst a number of people in the 40k community. And I will definitely say this in fairness, especially to me in recency, that I feel like this is, and unfortunately I'm propagating this a little bit by saying this in the first place, but I do feel like that this is more of a YouTube thing specifically, where there are a lot of people who don't like Tau in the 40k community because they supposedly don't fit the 40k style, they're too shootive in army, or they're kind of too good, like they're not evil they don't have as much evil compared to other factions, right? They're just like too clearly the good guys supposedly. But I think today when we go, not over just their lore, but why they can totally work in 40k game wise and lore wise and could absolutely be anybody's favorite faction. But I will say, kind of seemingly from the amount of people that play Tau, especially because I think I saw today in the time of recording that they were like the 8th most played in grand tournaments, so like official, Games Workshop tournaments, that seemingly they at least have some fans.
Okay, that's good to know.
At this point, Tau hate is like projecting. It's like done to meme people because it's kind of a meme now to say that they're bad. If you actually were to talk to people, they don't. It seems like it's like very much a vocal minority kind of thing.
So are these guys just the Protoss of Warhammer 40k? Because that's kind of the impression I'm getting, having not heard anything about them just yet.
Question. What are the Protoss again?
The Protoss from StarCraft?
See, I remember very little about StarCraft. Despite that StarCraft exists because of 40k, but yes, I remember very little about Protoss.
So everyone, this
StarCraft
is actually
in general.
This is actually the soft launch of the. We're already going to be doing a side podcast to this podcast where I teach Marshall about StarCraft lore. I suppose the thing I'm asking then in that case is that in any like sci-fi stories or epics or anything that have like a lot of different like factions, someone always has to be at the bottom. They may not necessarily even be just like a terrible option, but it's like somebody's got to be first, somebody's got to be in the middle, and somebody has to be at the bottom. And so the Protoss are kind of like that. They're not like awful, but they're the least favorite among like the general population of people that play.
I think that's a possibility. I think there are probably some newer factions, or maybe some, like, I think Votann might currently still live in that because they are literally the newest faction, and there's people who have mixed feelings on them. But I think that maybe would have been true with Tau for the longest time. But I don't think, again, from a negative standpoint, I think, again, just from every other newer faction was, I think, since Tau was Imperium based. So anything that's Imperium based already had some type of fan, because even if their army didn't exist, their lore existed. So they got kind of like a step ahead of any new Xenos army.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. They already had kind of a head start going on.
Yeah. So like in that regard. But let's go over.
But also, who are they?
Who are they? Let's really settle into that. So the Tau, to go back to their beginnings, the Tau were first discovered around 34K by the AdMech, kind of a exploratory fleet. They're just kind of figuring out what we're out in planets, like what's out there, what do we need to mark for, conquer, to bring into the fold of the Imperium. And this is after the Horus Heresy, so this is being done by, like I said, this one by the AdMech, because the Space Marines are figuring their stuff out, because they just dealt with a whole kerfuffle. So before they could get actually a colonizer fleet in and inevitably purge what were at the time a Stone Age era Tau people, a warp storm formed around the planet and made it completely inaccessible.
As it does.
6,000, real space years pass, right? And all of a sudden, things are, in terms of Tau lore, things become a little murky, because Tau legend states that within a period after essentially like a Renaissance-ish kind of era in terms of technology, or maybe even industrial age or colonial era level of tech, so like they have guns, they have ability to do warfare, and they have menial technologies, but not like they do now, or many of the other societies of the time. It was simple enough still. And it was in that time where they were essentially going to so much war with themselves that they were borderline pushing themselves to extinction. And this is when the Ethereals appear. And they are these seemingly psychic wielding Tau that essentially move to everybody and usher to both sides of the main conflict and kind of denounce to them, we must come together and embrace the greater good. We must work together to fight for a greater good so that we can survive and prosper. And see, this is a good note to this is a good place to note that the Tau essentially have zero natural psychers, or at least the way that the Imperium gets them, where they're just kind of inevitably connected to the warp. All Tau, apart from the Ethereals, have such a little connection to the warp that the forces of chaos essentially think of them as crumbs, because chaos thinks of souls as food all the time. And Eldar had crazy big souls, because they had a bunch of psychic presence, so they were really yummy. The Tau are crumbs. They have such little warp connection, they border on being blanks.
Oh.
So the Ethereals, though, seemingly are the ones who, they seem to emit some of this psychic energy, and it seems to and it helps persuade everyone to come together, which we'll talk more about that in a bit when we get to Ethereals themselves. But then in 40K, the warp storm emerges and opens, and emerge come the Tau with hyper advanced technology, AI, crazy advanced weaponry, and they are setting off to the stars to bring the galaxy together under the banner of the greater good through unity or through conquering, but they will bring the galaxy to the greater good.
And I'm sure the rest of the galaxy was very keen on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely actually get into a lot of the ways that they actually bring planets into the fold, but obviously, especially the other, more present societies, specifically the ones that we'll talk about in the show and the ones you can play in the game, were obviously the most resistant to that. But we have to talk a little bit about Tau society, because you can kind of see in their imagery, right? They look like they have pretty high tech stuff. They've got, they've got a bunch of, they've got a good number of spaceships. They have seemingly kind of this blaster weaponry. They have mech suits. They have drones.
They look remarkably clean for being in the Warhammer 40k universe.
Yes, which some people would say is a bad thing, but
well,
regardless. So the Tau Society has 5 castes, 4 main ones that are 95% of the population, and then there are the ethereals. So to kind of name them off first, the 4 other castes are the fire, water, earth, and air castes. And no, there is not an avatar to unite them all. But in a way, you could think of that as the ethereals.
All right, elemental, got it.
So obviously, one thing to note about the caste especially is the thing that'll become clear, right, is it's a caste system. It's not a fairy tale caste. It's a caste system. Like, it is what it is. And obviously, castes in 2024 terms, in our real life, they're pretty bad. They're not okay. They have a lot of problems. In 40k terms, it could be worse. You honestly could do a lot worse, especially with the way that their castes are set up. You honestly, based on what some other societies, even the Imperium, are doing, it ain't that bad. So the first one we'll talk about is the Fire Caste. So they are the most seen cast in 40k. So I think they do technically have the highest population, but it's hard to necessarily say. But they're obviously the one that we will see the most. They're the ones that you'll have models of in the game. They're the ones that you'll see the most art about. They are the ones that inevitably show up on most of these planets because you're fighting them. So they are warriors. They are bred as warriors. They spend their whole lives fighting or preparing for war. That is what they do. It's what they serve for. It's what they're passionate about even. They're inevitably trained culturally to understand their part in the greater good is to be the warriors. Every 4 years or so, they can potentially go through trials, which will get them promotions. And by getting promoted, you essentially go from being a foot soldier to a certain type of, essentially mech suit pilot or battle suit, and then go further and further up the ladder that way.
But it's only every 4 years?
They want you to ensure essentially that you're getting experience. So yes, you get through these trials every 4 years. They're open. Because, most of the time they don't want you to. They want you to have the experience of being in battle before they just throw a rookie into a mech suit. I'm looking at you, Neon Genesis Evangelion.
There are no angels in the 40k universe. That's not going to happen.
Well, there are, and honestly, there might not be that different to those ones.
Okay.
They just may not be called angels. But yes, so pretty much the only way out of war as a member of the Fire Caste is to die in battle or inevitably get ranked up so much that you become a war advisor, that you can kind of be a part of the total war planning segment of the Tau, of the fire caste. So far inevitably up. And at that point, though, you're likely fairly older at that point anyway, where that's kind of just the best way you can make use of yourself, too. The thing is, Tau biology, they only live about 50 years. So while a number of some of their stuff is shorter, like 4 years is a decent amount of time to them, right? And so if you go through all these promotions, you've been through it. At least in terms of a Tau lifespan. Going through their physiology a little bit, because we didn't actually touch on that quite yet, is so they, as you can kind of see in the imagery, they are blue-skinned. They don't have a standard nose. They kind of have their olfactory senses come from that like slit that kind of stems from their forehead and goes down.
Oh, okay.
And they are actually quite nearsighted. They can take a longer amount of time to focus on things from a distance, which is kind of why they become so reliant on their suits and on their helmets and being in either like the full mech suit or even being in their own battle armor with their helmets on. That helps them target from afar because they are, as I alluded to earlier, primarily ranged combatants.
Okay.
And we'll go over the full suit list later when we go out there over their general actual war tactics. First, let's actually move on then to the other castes. So, as I noted, there's, we have the water, earth, and air castes remaining. And we'll talk about the ethereals as well. But the water castes are generally diplomats. So most people don't really even actually see any of the rest of these castes in general, outside of maybe air and ethereals. But the water castes are the diplomats. They're generally sent in first. They go in and they try to create an alliance. That is always the Tau's first thing. They don't land anywhere with the intent to conquer and to invade. The only groups that they generally will just not deal with anymore are the ones you would play on the tabletop. So generally, though, the Imperium, orcs, Tyranids, the Tyranids from Tyranids and orcs from somewhat obvious reasons. Generally not the Eldar, though they probably are more willing to actually work with each other. So there is probably a number of scenarios where they will do that. Not likely the Drukhari, but maybe. But generally, I wouldn't imagine most of the Drukhari would actually be willing to do anything that would align with the greater good.
Yeah, no, that'd be my assumption, is that like most of these other factions would be more of the shoot first, ask questions later type, and you would just end up losing a lot of diplomats by going out this way.
Yes, and so that's why they've definitely developed tactics in order to do so. One human world that they were able to bring into Tau, they essentially did by bringing diplomats and kind of getting people that would understand their point of view into leadership positions and kind of just like slowly moving the planet from like the top down. But otherwise, if it's like a totally different xenos species, right? Like one that isn't an actual faction, but like it's just they go to this planet and has, this race of bug snake people, and they go and they try to talk to them. They are able to find ways to utilize their drones and their AI to communicate with other species. They'll create technology to help them communicate, and they will try to forge alliances or trade agreements, whatever they can, to inevitably bring the planet into the fold of the greater good and essentially try to uplift generally both sides. Because again, that's the greater good. It's not just to go there and crush, because everyone at their fullest strength will make use of their abilities. You hear me talking about this a lot. I'm going to momentarily kind of briefly go into one of the Tau's great memes, and that is the fact that they are weeaboo space communists.
I mean, you've definitely been emphasizing the greater good aspect of it, so I can get that
Yes.
there's this like community based sort of thing that they've got going on for their entire.
And so I want you to think about communism and the Tau as we
I do
continue
every
to
day.
go through the rest of these casts. So the air cat or the earth cast are next. They're honestly very simple to talk about because their job is, well, complicated, simple in terms of role. They are the engineers. They maintain and continue to push all Tau technology. They will repair the mechs. They will bring buildings. They'll create all the transports on planet, off planet, just everything that's your general workman around all the tech that is around the hyper advanced societies that the Tau have are held by the Earthcast. They create, repair drones. They work with drones very closely. They work with with Tau AI to continue to advance technology, and that's what they do. Very rarely do they set foot on the battlefield, similarly to the Watercast, where they don't usually either. But there is definitely more likely for there to be Earth than water or air because inevitably they might need to go out and do field repairs. But they're not usually the ones doing the fighting.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then we've got the Watercast, who are, or not, sorry, not the Watercast. Then we have the Aircast. They are the pilots. They are the most slender of all the Tau because inevitably part of that is actually a biological adaptation, which the Tau are actually very good at as a species. And they almost rarely ever set foot even on planets. Many of them born in space and often then live in floating cities or just even on their ships their whole lives. They are in charge of a number of things. So the Tau, because they are non-psychic, even with the ethereals, they are completely pale in comparison to the level of a psychic of even a standard human that just like randomly becomes psychic. So they are completely incapable of warp travel. So where everybody else in the galaxy inevitably is able to travel through space in almost a complete fraction of the time and without the greater FTL engines that would be needed to do so because they just essentially cut a hole through hell to get there. The Tau don't have that ability because they would not be able to see through the warp. They would get completely lost and be destroyed. So in order to do that, they have to just kind of do it the good old-fashioned way. Now they've developed ways to do it in a quick fashion, but because of that, the military vessels need pilots, but also messengers. Essentially, they have to carry messages, even though it's digitally. You got to relay messages through space because an electronic signal can only ever go so far. And the other societies again use the warp. Like the Imperium, they use the warp to do that. The Tau have to do it the classic way of just sending it off to a ship. That ship sends it off. They bring it off to someone else, and they just play telephone. But luckily, it's a digital signal, so they are good at it, and they don't have the actual telephone problem.
So because everybody else is psychic, they all have access to, AOL Instant Messenger, and these guys are still over here with the Pony Express having to like physically have things from ship to ship to ship because they can't just jump into the warp like that.
Exactly.
So then what advantage do they have as far as like being able to, because I feel like that's like a significant disadvantage anytime that they are in open conflict with another one of these factions. Like what advantage do they bring to the table then if they don't have that?
What they bring is their technology and firepower. While they are limited in their warp capacity, it has not limited their firepower. When they're in an engagement with another species, while yes, they are inherently more fragile, which we'll get into in their war style, they are just armed to the teeth and are able to completely push in terms of advancement with other factions. The other benefit that they have is because they are so slow, their empire is not only much smaller, but it means it's also more concentrated. It's not split up, and it's not, like one planet is like, yes, connected to the Imperium, but then it's got to send something at different random times, or just whenever they happen to decide to come collect. The Tau Empire is very connected with each other. They're constantly able to bounce off from planet to planet because they're inevitably they're not skipping over anywhere, right? They can only go one place to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. Like, their planets are all like congruent, where when, the Great Crusade for humans was going on in 30K, they would maybe, if there was a planet where it's like, all right, there doesn't seem to be much going on there, we'll mark it down for later, and then we're gonna move on to wherever we're needed as Space Marines, and then maybe the AdMech would come and finish it up, but like they sometimes maybe didn't, because there inevitably is not a perfect system. So there would maybe be planets that get undiscovered or get unchecked, hence Tau,
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, they're all spread out, and and inevitably that means they're also split up. Like the Empire, the Imperium may be vast and may outnumber in terms of population and like total number of guns, but the thing is, none of those guns would ever be turned on one faction at one time because they're just too disorganized in comparison. And that's where Tau's strength lies, is their togetherness, is their tech, is their ability to constantly beef themselves up and have stable workflow, not have planets kind of falling away from them, right? Because the Imperium leaves a planet for too long, all of a sudden, well, maybe we decided to rebel because we haven't been checked in with Daddy Imperium in a while. Hasn't given us our stipend recently, so we'll go on our own way. And that's where the Tau strength comes in, is that togetherness.
So it all comes back to them being the united front and the greater good and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And so finally we have the ethereals. They are the leaders. They generally are pushing where the Tau are going, how the Tau will expand forward. And they're also really the source of where most kind of believe the darkness and kind of the evil part of the Tau lie. Inevitably, since they are in charge, many think what they're really doing with this greater good, and from that time when they united the planet together, is that really what they're doing is utilizing their kind of weaker but innate psychic ability to brainwash and effectively control the Tau, right? Because while they are weaker psychic powers, they're still psychic powers to a non-psychic race. Sure. That potentially could have a bunch of effect on them, because you're looking at, people who aren't necessarily going to have any form of reaction psychically to somebody influencing them. And so one of the things that also happens is Tau who become disillusioned to the greater good and maybe would question the authority of the ethereals go into re-education to get that greater good knowledge thrown back into them. So there is reason to think that, and I've kind of thought that because of this, that there is maybe reason to think that there could be some type of influence from the Chaos Gods. I mean, you think about it, right? That the ethereals didn't show up until that warp storm did. Maybe there was some type of thing in that. There's nothing to showcase that at the moment, but that's my own personal thought process to that. But the most notable, that's the thing, right? One of the most notable protesters of the ethereals is Commander Farsight and his Farsight enclaves. Commander Farsight was one of the biggest leaders biggest leaders of the Tau at the time. He was kind of the main commander of the spheres of expansion is kind of what they call their crusades. And he was inevitably kind of left alone on this fight. I believe it was with the orcs, and kind of he was asking for assistance and help, and he was just kind of being left to be. And one of the big things that he wanted to utilize was to follow a fleeing orc system, because inevitably, from both kind of an honor and just from a like, we're gonna have to deal with them again if we don't get rid of them. And they didn't want him to, so he kind of was just like, peace, and left. And he and his sect were treated as renegades and were essentially denounced. So the great many statues that once existed in the Tau Empire to denote, Farsight as a, great hero of the Empire were torn down. He was cast aside and effectively been told to forget, be forgotten. And so, but while he's treated kind of as a traitor, unlike humans, the Tau actually abhor civil war to the point that they will not actively declare war on him or his Farsight enclave. Inevitably, they just kind of are like, we're just letting them we're going to let them alone, and we're going to tell our people, don't touch them. They're bad. It's essentially they're just pulling a political war, not a physical one, and they're just doing it through propaganda and stuff like that. And Farsight, to his credit, still believes in the greater good. He's just disillusioned with the Ethereal's view of it.
So where does that leave Farsight now? Who would he consider to be like Farsight and his group? Who would they consider to be their biggest enemy, or what is their goal?
I would say their biggest enemy is still mostly dealing with the orcs and Tyranids for the most part. They generally, like I said, they generally still believe in the greater good, and they still believe in protecting the Tau Empire. They want to stand as that, but obviously through propaganda, some of the Tau don't believe that to be the case, but his whole thing is kind of around that. There was he got a recent plot update in 9th edition, but it was kind of small from what I had recalled, but inevitably he was able to at least kind of assist, I think in a somewhat recency. I don't remember how old the third sphere of expansion is, but it was in that he was able to attempt to assist a main Tau force try to protect essentially the grand leader of the Tau and even the Ethereals, because the Ethereals generally work as a council, and then they essentially kind of have a speaker.
Okay.
Their speaker of the house. So all the Ethereals, though, otherwise are a big council. And that guy got assassinated by the Imperium. And it was in that Farsight tried to help, but inevitably they were not successful. They were able to save their current main commander of the main Tau fleet, but otherwise he is just kind of continuing to set his fight for the greater good his own way. But very popular. People love his model. This is his newest model. I love the design of it. He's one of the few Tau though that actually does enjoy melee combat. And it's he uses an ancient, I believe it's an Eldaria weapon, that was discovered, and is obviously huge because he's holding it in a mech suit that's
right. Yeah, no, you can
the size of a house.
You can compare it to the tree next to him for scale.
Yeah. So he's a very unique but well liked figure in terms of people, not in 40K. But yeah, so let's actually talk a bit about Tau warfare. What do they do? How do they utilize battle?
Well, you said with Farsight there that you said he's one of the ones that really enjoys melee combat, as if that isn't something that most of the other fire cast that's out on the battlefields actually enjoys.
Correct. So technology is very key to Tau armies. They, like the natural born Tau people, and they, compared to a lot of the other factions, it's kind of the unique aspect with their battle suits, and they're generally primarily being a shooting army. They kind of don't like to do melee combat. There have been some sources that say that they think it's primitive. Others would say it's potentially just because their physiology doesn't work well. They're inherently, from a muscle mass perspective, weaker compared to a lot of other species. So others would kind of think that, like, well, they're, that would be why they're not as good at melee. But while they'll have close combat weapons when they need it, their biggest thing is not only their ranged weaponry, but as I said before, their battle suits. They are key to the Tau warriors, and they obviously, as a result of this, are given the common joke of they are the Gundam army. Do you like Gundams?
We addressed this briefly in the last episode, and I am glancing over at my Gundam model kits right now as you show me this. Yes, my heart rate has increased.
They, and some people use it as a kind of dumb way to attack the army, but I think, honestly, one of the arguments that this is a good point to bring up is how they supposedly look too different compared to the rest of the setting. And my argument to that is how, most people's frame of reference to that, right, is the Gothic style that exists in the Imperium, right? They have a very, kind of this, like, very gaudy, Gothic, ancient architecture, grand cathedral style look to their buildings, to their ships, to everything. Mm-hmm. And while that's generally most people's frame of reference for 40K, and then with the Eldar, they look nothing like the Gothic style that the humans have. And the Necron only somewhat have a similar thing to one of the human civilizations, because the Thousand Sons came from a world that also seems to really like pyramids, and what we would call the Egypt style. But other than that, Necron look completely different. They're robotic skeletons that use Gauss weaponry that create antimatter. Like, there's nothing the same. So my always thought is, like, how can you say that they look nothing like these five other unique factions, but then be like, but that one's unique? They're all unique. What do you mean? They're all different. They're all their own design.
Obviously I have to take your word for it, because, I don't know what a Necron is, but, like, I can see a lot of the heavy lifting of that argument being done by the actual artwork itself. Like, I'm looking at it, and I think a lot of, like, how these suits are being presented, how they're, even down to, like, how they're shaded, they have this very sleek, flat look to these mech suit designs that does, for me at least, it evokes more of something like a Patlabor or an Appleseed than anything that I've seen with the Space Marines in 40K or anything like that. There's definitely more of a roundness to a lot of the armor with the Space Marines as well. And obviously with these suits, like, you can see it's almost entirely composed of rectangles and triangles. There's not a lot of points with a lot of, like, really rounded edges to them. So, like I say, I can kind of see the argument for it, but I also haven't been introduced to some of these other factions you're talking about, and so I'm sure in time I'll see how that's kind of like a silly statement. But otherwise, like, yeah, like, my first time looking at these suits, I immediately was thinking, like, Robotech. I'm thinking, like, 80s sci-fi mech anime with, like, very specific mech designs that are meant to be very, like, sleek, aerodynamic, and definitely not what I would personally think of when I'm thinking of, like, Space Marines.
But your point of, like, them being the most angular is probably, that is where, like, they are unique. Everyone else does generally have that more round design, where theirs is that flat angular way more. But again, it's just that concept of like, why can these 4 other factions and like races be unique, but this one can't, right? Because inevitably they all still look unique from each other. They don't look like they borrow, like Eldar don't look like they borrow things from humans. Humans don't look like they borrow things from Necrons. They all have their own unique style. So why can't Tau? But besides that, yes, the suits are super important to their way of war, which is 2 concepts. They rely on the concept of Mont Ka, which is the concept of like a more standard, like all out, battlefront war. So the idea of doing precise, clear strikes to clear an enemy, to attack a stronghold, to specifically pincer strike into weak points of of a base or city, and weaken the enemy through an actual attack. Where then they have Kauyon, which is the concept of stealth, laying traps, subtly attacking, and they will utilize both of these concepts in their wars. They don't just stick with one if they're one group and the other if they're a different one. It's all just dependent on what their current objective and design is. And they will use these suits in order to utilize that. So they have stealth suits, which when looking at this main image, it is the smallest of mech suits next to the normal Tau soldier there. And those are ones that can go into complete cloaking. They often will not be part of the main battle. They will generally go off and kind of do their own side objective that assists the army. They'll go in and maybe remove a depot. They'll set up an ambush for maybe like a command unit that's maybe moving to a different location, whatever they need to do. The next biggest one you'll find is the crisis suits. Those are really actually the next 3 you see in this image. They're just kind of dependent on their level of command. So the kind of main ones you'll see are going to be the standard battle suit, and then you will see ones in what are commanders in what are called Cold Star and Enforcer suits. They're all just based on loadout in terms of their naming. So not as an important detail to really go over. It's essentially just that like those mechs are going to be the ones that'll have the commanders in them. They won't be in the biggest ones, but they'll be in the ones that'll have the most, like, say, maneuverability or take the most skill to learn and master. Hence why you have to go through one, then the other, then the other, then the other to get to it. That is the type of suit that you will see. Like, you will see someone like Commander Farsight in. He is in a type of, like, Cold Star battle suit.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And then finally, the biggest mechs, which have a variety of different aspects to them, are the broadside battle suits. And they are essentially mobile artillery. They will be equipped with gigantic Gauss cannons. They will be equipped with like 500 missiles.
Do they have POW bunkers?
Do they have what?
Do they have POW bunkers?
What's a pile bunker?
Oh, okay. But stay tuned, everyone, for the Side podcast where I teach Marshall about the pile bunker, and we just watch Big O in its entirety. Coming soon.
Oh my god, dude! I haven't watched Big O in years. I barely remember that show. I only remembered seeing it as a kid on Toonami.
Well, it's time for a refresher course.
But the mobile artillery part is so keen with them that they will get into battle, and then they will literally like lock themselves down. Like stilts will come out of the legs to brace them so that they can fire as devastating of a blast as they can. They're sweet.
That's good stuff.
They're sick.
You have my full attention.
Yeah. They will utilize their drones in a various level of what they will do. So they'll be used to help with targeting.
Pancake.
They will be used to help with they'll be used to help with shielding, to assist in their stealth. Could just keep their systems running. They have a sniper drone. They have a sniper drone controller. They utilize much of everything with their drones. Their drones are just a part of their system. So when you see them out in war, and you get, especially on the tabletop, when you see them when figures, pretty much whenever you get a Tau figure, especially once you get a Tau box, whatever it may be, you'll also generally get a drone with it. Maybe two, depending on the box. So there are a lot. So the back of this image here, this is an army picture from a user called Nazaroff on the website Scarhand Painting. And in the very back, you'll see that is one of the broadsides. The four big ones are all broadsides, but that's the one I was talking about, where it's got the mega cannon. Mm-hmm. It's got the mega Gauss cannon, and it has 50 missile pods on each shoulder.
They're like leather jacket studs.
Yeah, it's ready. It is there to blow some shit up.
So the drones are almost like foot soldiers in terms of just the sheer number of them that you'll have.
Yeah, but they're less treated like soldiers. They're a lot more treated like companions and assistants. They have a very, like I noted kind of before, they have a very symbiotic relationship with their drones, and because they have one with their AI. So when they're in war with them, while the drones traditionally, one of the previous editions of 40K, the drones were almost just kind of used as body shields. Which didn't necessarily fit the lore of Tau, but it was kind of funny because it's just protect me, drone. Mm-hmm. Now they're used a lot more as a war gear kind of benefit thing. So it's a little more fitting flavor-wise. At the beginning of the edition, it made them a little squishy, but they figured that stuff out. They seem to have figured a lot of that stuff out by this point. But the Tau are not alone as a species in the Tau Empire. There are other species within their empire. And one of the most common you'll see of other xenos species, because it would include humans as well in the greater good. But one of the most common xenos species you'll see are the Kroot. They are generally primitive, especially compared to the Tau themselves. They come from a planet called Perch, and they, while primitive, are still very intelligent. They are very adaptive. They actually will consume their enemies because they can actually intake that biological data and adapt themselves to it. So if they're fighting a species that can naturally cloak itself, they will consume that enemy and they will begin to form that adaptation and be able to kind of cloak into their environment, just like their hunting species.
That is a neat party trick. Are there limitations to that?
Well, inevitably their limitations are kind of their somewhat melee focus, but then also relatively weak physiology. Okay. They do shoot, as you can kind of see by this image, but they are primarily a melee kind of focused army. But they work well in the greater good because they serve really well as kind of a melee force that can kind of jump into the battle after it's been started for the Tau. And it's a great time to be a Kroot fan because they just got a big range refresh in the game. So they've got new models that actually look good now. And they have a whole, in the codex that'll be coming out after this episode is being recorded, but might be around when it airs. The Kroot also have a detachment where you can essentially play exclusively Kroot. So you can, even though you're playing the Tau Empire, you can play only Kroot models in an attachment, which is cool.
Huh.
Options.
Yeah.
But yeah, they are a part of the Tau Empire, so inevitably they can always be used together, and they will often be used together. Next are the Vespid and their sting wings.
What am I looking at right now?
Well, what they're called sting wings. What do they also look like, Dylan?
They a lot
do
of.
You remember something else that was called a sting winger?
I'm blanking right now. What's that?
Power Rangers Lost Galaxy minions. They look exactly like them.
Oh, right.
And they
Power
have
Rangers
the same
Lost
name,
Galaxy.
essentially. The Vespid Stingwings and Lost Galaxy had the Stingwingers.
Right. The series that isn't Dino Thunder, of course.
Hey, Lost Galaxy is one of the best ones.
We can't get into this. We're trying to talk about Warhammer.
That's right.
We'll
and
be here all night.
Conceptually, 2 people die in it. One of them for real. Anyway,
back to these monstrosities.
These are the Vespid. And they're potentially kind of an indication of like the darkness of the Tau. So they're the flying ranged units that are used by Tau. They're less common on the tabletop, but supposedly pretty prominent in the Tau Empire. Again, they don't have the models to showcase for it. But one of the things that people kind of have theorized is that one of the things about them is the only way that they were able to work with the Tau is once they inevitably gave them these devices that allowed them to communicate. Now, there's a lot of people that believe that these devices are essentially mind controlling the Vespid, and thus they are a part of the Tau Empire unwillingly. Because up to that point, they were just willing to go to war and just kill any Tau that showed up. But they were primitive, and thus the Tau felt like there was a way to make it work. And supposedly they found that solution with these devices. But again, are they actually communicating, or are they just mind controlling them? But that's really it. There's not much else to say about them. They're winged. They're kind of bug looking, and they shoot things.
Gotcha.
That's about it.
They don't have you mentioned sting wings before
that's just what their units are called. It's just they're the Vespid sting wings.
Okay. They don't literally have like, stingers on their wings or anything like that.
They might have.
You just haven't gotten close enough to want to find out. Okay.
Yeah. There's just there's not a whole lot of literature on them.
Gotcha.
And then finally we have the humans in the Empire, or as they're named, the Guevasa or Guevesa. It's like G-U-E apostrophe, because there's always apostrophes. V-E-S-A.
Guevasa.
And generally when especially a lot of times it'll be like Imperial Guard or a lot of Imperial citizens come to the Tau Empire. A lot of times they're integrated into the Firecast, generally because they're already soldiers at one point.
That makes a lot of sense. Yep.
So they're just like, okay, well, you go into the Firecast.
Yep.
So you'll see a lot of them kind of working with the Firecast. The one downside to that as being a human in the Tau Empire is you will never move up you'll never be able to move up the same way the other Tau can. You won't be able to go into a battle suit as far as I've ever seen. They've never had a noted battle suit pilot human. Part of the reason that you could probably surmise to that is the deep connection that Tau have to their pilot, to their suits. Like they form a bond. Like they'll eat and be near their, like whenever they're not sleeping or training outside of their suit, they're with their suit. Like it's just it's a bond that they share with them. They're essentially like they coexist in that way. Otherwise, they still inevitably while they live a war-filled life, many of them do see it as a reprieve in comparison, because maybe when they're being stationed at, or maybe they're told to go protect, isn't really nearly as bad. And maybe they're fed and just treated nicer. They don't have somebody barking down their neck in the same way. They're not being kind of told that their life is shit and that they just need to die. They need to go die for the Imperium. They're told to fight for the Empire, but they're not specifically told you're only good if you fight and you kill, and if you don't, then you die. The Firecast's belief in war is far more, just like intrinsical. Like, it's just, to them, war, being in battle is a glory in life. It is living to fight for the greater good. Other than that, a couple of notable things to make note here, other than about the General Tau. One of them is the current commander, Shadow Sun, the main leader of the Tau forces of expansion. She trained under Farsight, but was inevitably, when she was told that Farsight had betrayed the Tau, that she was upset at his betrayal, partook in the destruction of his statues.
Oh, good.
But when I talked about that scene where, that ethereal leader gets killed and assassinated, she was supposed to be part of his protective staff or part of the army. And she was not able to do so. But after he died, she was able to have a conversation with Farsight, assist in his own kind of escape, because I think they were planning. She was originally told to capture him and bring him as prisoner, probably be re-educated. But instead, she started to kind of see maybe the ethereals are a little questionable. Because that's been the thought, right? There have been many notes of Tau. The farther from the ethereals that they get, the more and more they start to kind of be like, wait a minute. Most of them, like Shadow Sun, still will believe in the concept of the greater good because, again, on paper, the greater good sounds awesome, right? Everybody works to a better goal, right? And does their job to achieve that goal. Everybody has a role to fill. But maybe the way the ethereals kind of act, a little high and mighty sometimes, maybe it's a little unnecessary.
Yeah.
So she still shows loyalty to both sides, and she doesn't really showcase her slight disillusionment. She still has belief that the concepts of what the ethereals have can work. Just a grain of salt, Otherwise, gaming-wise, the Tau definitely are still not for everyone. At this point, I feel like it probably has also maybe become a little bit clearer why they have the joke of being the weeaboo space communists.
Well, yeah, because they appeal to me specifically. So, yeah. It makes sense.
But I'll be honest, Games Workshop, in their past, haven't helped themselves when it comes to furthering that stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to play you an audio clip from Dawn of War. And these are the sounds. These are the audio sounds of the Tau commander in that game when you play it in Dark Crusade or Soulstorm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, have a listen here.
I am ready to lead. I will spread the greater good. Chassot, ready to take command. Prosper as Tau
Are you noticing a
shall.
theme with his voice lines?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That is just.
This was 2000. Granted, this was 2006 or 7.
That is just Mortal Kombat VO to a T of I am the Asian Oriental. Wise.
And I couldn't find a good clip that showcased both of these things. But the song that is their army song is
don't tell me
the Japanese I forget what instrument it is, but it's the stereotypical
like a tin pan or a sitar.
Yeah,
type thing.
yeah.
Oh my god, come on.
Yeah.
It's a future
Well, and that's the thing it is not a meme. The thing that is not a meme is that they are in fact they have inspiration from Gundam, right? And Japanese mech suits. That is not a meme. That is fact. GW artists, when they were designing the Tau, they looked at things like Gundam, like Robotech, all of that stuff, and were like, let's do something like that, but we'll make it our own. And they did that successfully. They very much have their own design. But yeah, unfortunately, they did do the thing when, especially making Dawn of War,
that's still the whole thing of let's just do the Three Kingdoms. It's that's so separated from Gundam and Robotech and all that. They aren't doing that in any of those series. It's just
I just mean the
actual suit designs.
Yeah, it's just and that's the thing, right? I still love them. I love them as Weeaboo space
I really do like the designs. I think the designs are really cool. Like I said, I mean they just literally they match a lot of 80s into the 90s mecha anime that I've been a fan of for a long time. So the designs are really cool. Yeah,
and so that being said, I can understand where 100%. The Tau are not for everyone, but no army is for everyone. The only one that maybe fits that is Space Marines. I think most people who come into 40K can find one Space Marine chapter out of the hundreds that exist that they're like, I vibe with that. Other than that, really no faction is for everyone, and even Space Marines aren't for everyone.
Some people can't handle, some people can't handle aesthetics that combine real Robo with Super Robo, and we call those people cowards, and we move on with our day. We call them weak, and we accept that, and we move on.
So, I will note then, the part of the reason, though, they're not everyone's style is that because they are such a vastly shooting army, if you're somebody whose play style in general, in in video games and whatnot, is to be the melee person, then Tau aren't going to be your favorite. They're just not. And that's fine. You can have that play style taste. For example, when I built my first army, I was debating between Sisters or Tau. And the reality I came to was that I love doing melee stuff in a lot of games and in gameplay. I love having the mix between ranged and melee, but I do like melee. And as a result, my sister's army has a melee focus to it. A lot of the weaponry and the units I pick are to assist their abilities in melee. That'll do better once they finally get a codex, but until that point, that is the case. But in Tau, didn't really have that to satiate me, but I still love their look and all that nonetheless. Mm-hmm. And I love them lore-wise, right? They're still one of my favorite factions. It's just in everything else. I'll play them in the Rogue Trader, TTRPG, not the video game, the TTRPG. Mm-hmm. And I love looking at their lore. I love learning about them. I love seeing art of them, It's cool. Their models are cool. I have one model of them because that was when I wanted to learn how to model with 40K. It was the first model I got. I bought. The technical first one I got was a free Space Marine. Which, if you ever go to a Warhammer store and you're like, hey, I want to try this out, they'll usually, any of them, they'll give you a free Space Marine. So go do that, by the way. If you want to learn it, this is for you.
I will go to the nearest
Warhammer
Warhammer
Space
store.
Marine.
That is definitely
Games
around.
Workshop, or Warhammer. They use both. Mm-hmm. But still, other than that, some people. One of the big claims that people will say to disparage the Tau as well is that you are playing a different game, quote unquote, and that's kind of taken from a Bricky video. As much as I love Bricky, this is maybe a take, and it's an older video. Maybe a take that I don't think works that well. I mean, they're the 8th most played faction in the game. Seemingly enough people like to play with them, and they seem to be playing the game just fine because it's not like they're dominating. They're decent, they're good, but they're not dominating. And they weren't dominating when they started. The thing is, every army creates different games. Like, especially when you look at Eldar. Eldar, the way they play, which we'll get to when we talk about them further, is they'll, like, essentially, quote-unquote, jump on and off the board frequently. Like, essentially disappearing from battle. You know, they have a bunch of movement shenanigans they can do. You know, orcs are kind of like the opposite of Tau. Their shooting is pretty terrible, but their melee is amazing. So it's essentially just like, for orcs, it's like, let's race to get to the enemy the fastest. And your game now becomes, please keep them away from me for the love of God. Until I can shoot them a little bit. You know, like personally, for example, when I played my friend who has orcs with my sisters, the only reason I ended up winning the game is because I hit an amazing first round of shooting. Like my first turn with shooting was really good. I got to kill a number of units, like of model, like physical orcs, before they could reach me. Because once they reach me, it's a bad time.
Gotcha. There's
a lot of axes going at a lot of women, and those women don't survive those axes. So, regardless, the game of 40K is about adaptation. And so if you're playing against Tau, and yes, they used to have, I think, some rules, I think they still do, that allows them to keep a distance from you. That's the game, baby. And at some point, you run out of board, or they get off their own objectives. So at that point, you've put them in a bad spot. Yeah, they can shoot you, but they're not on the objectives. And that's how you win games. So in the end, the game can always be played the way you want to play it, as long as you know what you're doing. And that's by learning the game. So if you want to get Tau, get Tau. If you want to, if you think they look cool and you like shooting and you like the battle suits, also vehicles, they have plenty of those vehicles, then do it. Play the Tau. Get all the vehicles.
Ooh.
Shoot them all. Get the drones. Do what you wish.
This is very
because the Tau are cool.
Aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah,
this is a good color combination being used.
This
here.
final imagery, this is actually this used to be the main like color scheme of the Tau. Currently, they use more of this white. Like this is what you see on the box,
which is very palatable.
To see on this box, yeah. What you see on this box now, or what you used to see on the box, was this tan and then tan camo colors.
Huh.
Yeah. That used to be their main army color, and then they kind of just shifted, which happens sometimes. They just will be like, we think this will sell better. They're just like, I think this will be more appetizing on the front of the box. I'm pretty sure because right now, if you look at an Eldar box, it'll be the red armor with white helmets. I'm pretty sure that wasn't always the case. You could probably, if you looked up a picture of an old like Eldar unit box from like the 90s, it probably was a different color. And well, the Eldar haven't been really updated since the 90s, so we've got that going for us. But that is everything Tau. You already kind of noted your kind of enjoyment of their.
Listen, man, I like them.
Of their style.
I'm a simple man. You give me something like that is very clearly reminiscent of a very specific era of mech and mecha that I enjoy, then, obviously I'm going to look at that and be like, hey, that looks pretty cool. That looks pretty neat. I haven't heard anything today that made me go like, oh my God, these guys are terrible. Get them away. I think they're cool. I think I'm more than happy to look at them from just like a superficial point and be like, yep, those are cool robots.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've always loved their design. I think they after, actually owning a Dawn of War game, because the first, I think, army that interested me was the Eldar, but the first one that like that was just because I had happened to play the first Dawn of War at my cousin's house. And the first one only has 4 armies in it. So when I actually got to see all the armies, or most of the armies in the Dark Crusade expansion of Dawn of War, the Tau were the ones that I gravitated to. Because similarly, it's just that 90s mecha design that I also loved and still do.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, at some point, we'll, you know, there's probably a reality where, yes, we will likely have some type of discussion, where we will, a Gunpla will end up on my shelf one day, for sure. There's not a doubt in that. It's just a matter of when.
That's the death trade. We're gonna make 50 episodes of the series, and at the very end of it, I am going to buy a single unit of Warhammer 40k figures, and then you are going to buy a Gunpla, and that will be the end of our skeleton contract with each other.
Sounds good. So yeah, I mean the Tau are, as we noted, the Tau are fighting for the greater good.
The greater
and that
good.
greater good might make them
the greater
be
good.
face communists.
I
wouldn't have them any other way.
I can't remember if I asked, who is the Karl Marx of the Tau?
Effectively, like,
would it be Fortnite or whatever his name was?
The Karl Marx would technically be that first ethereal that showed up and was like, "Hey, everyone."
Yeah, because he laid down the principles of like, here's how everything should be.
Yes, right, exactly. But the Stalin of the Tau was definitely that dude that got assassinated.
Yeah. Okay.
100%, because he definitely did some questionable things in his time.
Mm-hmm.
Again, all those slightly questionable aspects of the Tau generally are fronted. I mean, again, the council decided to do it, but he was the poster child. He put his face on the posters.
Gotcha.
So, you know, he ain't innocent.
Mm-hmm.
But that'll do it for this episode. Next week, we're finally going to talk about him. The tech priests of Mars.
They have a Mars?
They're the machine freaks. Are they lathered in oil? Yes. Is it for what you think? Probably not.
Wait, what?
It's the Adeptus Mechanicus. Next week on Heretic Hammer. You'll find out next week what I mean about that. Don't worry about it. Goodbye.
Goodbye.